Thank you for tuning in to an episode of InRange. This is going to be another one in the lever action gun series. Hopefully this one's going to bring you a lot of interesting information, essentially the history and origins of the iconic American lever action rifle. And I'm going to walk through the development of this rifle from the early or late 1840s, early 1850s up until 1873. The lever action rifle continued to be an American icon past 1873, but in this video we're going to specifically focus on the ones that today we would call pistol caliber. Back then, the line between pistol caliber and rifle caliber was much more unclear and diffused, but today we would call all of these pistol caliber type chamberings. That said, let's go ahead and start with the beginnings of this, which in the late 1840s, early 1850s, a man by the name of Hunt came up with the idea of forming something later called the rocket ball. At the time, there really wasn't self-contained ammunition like we see here, but what we did have are projectiles much like this. This is an actual Civil War 58 caliber Minié ball for a muzzle loader. It's intentionally undersized dimensionally to the bore diameter so that it can be seated with a ramrod in a foul bore. But when this seats against the powder charge and it's ignited by a percussion cap, the expanding gases of the black powder cause the tail of this hollow base projectile to expand and engage the rifling as it goes down the barrel, thus stabilizing it in flight. But Mr. Hunt looked at this and decided to do something different. He packed this hollow base with the powder charge and an ignition system and made this really in the late 1840s, early 1850s, the very first form of caseless ammunition. How funny is that? But anyways, that ultimately became called the rocket ball round. And two men really caught the attention of two different investors at that time, a man by the name of Smith and another man by the name of Wesson. And they worked with Mr. Hunt to develop the very first really self-contained cartridge repeating action, which was then later named the Volcanic. It is a toggle link system, identical in function to what you see with what became the Winchester, and nothing more changed than that. So they started that, the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company, or the Volcanic Arms Company, and the problem with that company is that the ammunition was very anemic. That rocket ball ammunition, even with improvements, was very low velocity and had very bad terminal ballistics. And as a result, it really didn't have a place in the market. There was another person, however, that saw this company and had another idea about where to go with it. And his name was Winchester, and he started investing in them as well. Due to the fact that the gun couldn't be sold because of those terminal ballistics very well on the market, the company went insolvent and went bankrupt. But Winchester continued the idea and formed the New Haven Arms Company and brought over what was then the shop superintendent for the original Volcanic Company, a guy by the name of Henry. Henry started working for the New Haven Arms Company and did nothing more to the Volcanic repeating rifle, but decided to do something different with the ammunition. They abandoned the rocket ball ammunition and developed something new, the 44 Henry rimfire, which was a self-contained cartridge that allowed the projectile to be seated in, of course, in a case, rimfired, primered, and had 28 grains of black powder behind it, significantly more than what was in the original rocket ball ammunition. This changed the game dramatically. By taking the original Volcanic design, the toggling system, which was proven to be a good, reliable repeater, and turning it into a self-contained cartridge case, that meant you had a 200 grain bullet on top of 28 grains of black powder, sometimes a 210 grain bullet. And what that did is allowed you to put that 210 grain projectile out of the 1860 now Henry rifle at approximately 1,200 feet per second. This actually had terminal ballistics. It had capability. This made the 1860 Henry a viable weapon, not only for military applications, but for civilian ones as well. And the Henry became the first iconic American lever action rifle that, of course, the Confederates referred to as the Union rifle that you load on Sunday and shoot all week. At a capacity of 15 plus 1 of that 44 Henry rimfire, that certainly would seem to be the case when you yourself were armed with a single shot muzzle loader. That became an incredibly huge disruptive technology in the world, and we've got a video on InRange now that's quite a bit old about it being, I would call it, the first assault rifle because it filled that niche. However, at that point, Winchester changed the name to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, and Mr. Henry, who was the shop superintendent and ultimately the progenitor of the ammunition that made the 1860 Henry viable, felt that the gun could not be improved, but others felt differently. Another man by the name of King developed a loading system right here that you see in the next development of the 1860 Henry, becoming the 1866 Winchester. Same exact cartridge, 44 Henry rimfire, but instead of loading it from the top, you load it through the actual side port of the receiver. This allowed you to do a lot of tactically sound things. First of all, you could just easily stuff rounds in here and top it off. Even if you fired 4 rounds, you could just easily top it off, something you could not do with the 1860. So when you're on the move, a couple more rounds in this, in theory, this gun would never run dry if you could keep feeding ammunition into the rear. You could stay prone, turn it on its side, feed ammunition in it, and that was a huge tactical advantage and mechanical advantage, and a huge improvement of the 1860 Henry design that ultimately culminated in the 1866 Winchester, and once again, still chambered in that 44 Henry rimfire. This was a wildly successful rifle that continued to be produced for a very long time and continued to be purchased even after later developments happened in the lever action world. And the 44 Henry rimfire cartridge continued to be produced up until, I believe, the 1930s, which goes to show you how long and how much longevity that particular round had, very much like we would think of 5.56 today. So that was a huge improvement. We're going to go through these a little more shortly in closer detail. But that happened in 1866, and nothing really changed for a while. That gun was, for all tactical purposes, sound. Nothing really needed to change, and it was nothing more than a very relatively simple modification to what was the original 1860 Henry. The toggle link action in both of those guns is identical. The lifter action, the way it functions, nothing whatsoever is different. However, another big thing happened in 1873. Now, this is where you see a huge improvement and leap forward in terms of the actual Winchester repeating lever action rifle. Another improvement, much like the 44 Henry was a huge improvement to the 1860 Henry from the Volcanic, was that this, in 1873, was released in a new cartridge called the 4440, which is right here. This was a big step up in terms of terminal ballistics. So if the 44 Henry rimfire was a 210 grain bullet moving at approximately 1,200 feet per second out of a rifle, the 44 Henry was a 200 grain bullet leaving a 24-inch barrel, the same barrel length, at 1,800 feet per second, making it far more ballistically capable, giving a flatter, easier shooting trajectory, making hits easier, all the things that come with the flatter shooting cartridges, and of course more power meant that it was more ballistically capable against whatever you shot with it, whether it was wild game or an enemy assailant. There were other big improvements to the 1873, which we're going to go over more closely with some updated detail there. But first, let's go through the cartridge development of what made all of this happen. As we've seen, the actual toggle link system didn't change really basically past the 1850s with the Volcanic. The same toggle link system in the 1873 is mechanically no different than that what was in the Volcanic, at least not very discernibly so. But the cartridges made a big difference. So let's go focus on that first. So as I said, let's start off with let's go from the beginning to modern day. So this is not a rocket ball, and I told you that I don't have one of those, but it is a 58 caliber Civil War bullet. And you can see that hollow base there is what would have been filled with the powder charge and used as the self-contained projectile as an early form of caseless ammunition. This is actually a 45 Cowboy Special. It's a 45 Colt case cut down to be the dimensional equivalent of the original 44 Henry. I'm leaving it here to give you context of what is on this table here. But this is self-contained. Of course, this is primer activated versus rimfire. But dimensionally, this is the same. This is a 200 grain bullet or 210 grain bullet with 28 grains of black powder behind it, and it leaves a 24-inch 1860 Henry at approximately 1,200 feet per second. This is a 45 Schofield, which is a topic for a different day, but I wanted to provide it for context of overall size. This is the 44 Henry, which was developed and provided for the first time in 1873 as the standard cartridge of the 1873 Winchester, and this was the big deal about why the 1873 Winchester was an upgrade. This is now a 200 grain bullet, leaving a 24-inch barrel at 1,800 feet per second. That is a huge jump. And you will see that at the same time, in 1873, another company came out with a different cartridge, the 45 Colt. Now this is a modern 45 Colt cartridge case. And the reason you don't see the 45 Colt in the original lever action rifles, this is by the way a topic for another video for another day, is that the rim was very, very diminutive. And it wasn't capable to be properly chambered and extracted out of a lever action rifle. Modern 45 Colt cases have a better rim, and it makes them viable in lever action rifles, and that's why you see that there. One other thing you saw they tried to do with the 4440 is this has a shoulder to it, and in theory this very thin neck would expand and cause there to be less black powder fouling blown back into the action, because black powder is a very dirty propellant. I have found that if you load these cartridges to sufficient velocities and pressures that you don't really have a lot of back pressure or blowback, even in a straight wall case. And the original 44 Henry rimfire was a straight wall case as well. But to repeat, this right here shows you the history of the lever action rifle just in cartridges alone. Rocket ball as the Volcanic, 44 Henry rimfire as the 1860 and 1866. Schofield is not relevant in the conversation, just there for context. 4440 becomes the definitive cartridge that's really made the Winchester pop at much higher velocities and much better terminal ballistics. And 45 Colt, roughly the equivalent in terms of capability, but really was only chambered in pistols. One other interesting side note to that is the reason 4440 and 45 Colt was not in a lever action at the time, is there was a gentleman's agreement between Colt and the Winchester company that Colt would make pistols and Winchester would make lever action rifles. So here we have the 1860 Henry. Now this is a reproduction by Uberti. Originals are worth a lot of money and really not usable because 44 Henry rimfire is no longer produced. However, it is still an iconic lever action, and it feeds through this magazine tube right here. You move this all the way up, turn it, put the cartridges down from the front, down this magazine tube, let the follower drop on them cautiously and carefully, cycle the action, and every time you run the action, it ejects the spent cartridge case out the top, and then feeds a new one, which allows you to fire all 15 plus 1 rounds as fast as you can run the lever, chamber the round. Mr. Henry pretty much thought that this was the best possible configuration and that there was no room for improvement on it, but he was ultimately wrong. Functionally, you can see these are the same thing. There's really nothing different going on here. The big difference is the magazine tube is no longer open, which is a good guard against dirt and debris. You don't feed it from the front anymore like you do with the Henry. You feed it through this Kingsgate patent, but you just shove the rounds in here. But functionally, same exact thing. Every time you cycle this lever, the round pops onto the lifter gets indexed with the chamber, the bolt puts the round into the chamber, the hammer fires it. Cycle, cycle, cycle until all the rounds are depleted out of the magazine. This Kingsgate patent and loading system alone fundamentally made what was originally the 1860 Henry into a far more field viable weapon with a better, not only the ability to be more impervious to dirt and debris in the field, but also a more tactically sound design, and that you could feed it consistently, top it off, use it in combat without having to expose yourself or go out of a prone position. Nothing is mechanically different with a couple small exceptions. With the original Henry, there was only one screw holding on the plates. It was the screw that held in the held in the lever, and then also indexed with the toggle. If you pull this screw out, this plate and that plate both come off, and that's how you get into the internals of the gun. They improved that a little bit with the 1866. That screw and that screw hold on the plate. If you take this screw out only slightly, and then take that screw out, you can leave the left side receiver plate on the receiver on, and you can remove just the plate with the loading gate off. Pulling this plate off allows you to leave the internals intact. They don't just all fall out, and you can clean this gun internally without completely disassembling it. The Henry, when you take the screw out, everything kind of just falls apart, and you have to then repair it or put it back together in the field. The 1866 allowed for much easier field maintenance as a result. Mechanically, though, everything's the same. Nothing's different, and you can see when you put them next to each other, they really are identical guns. However, in 1873, technology changed a lot, or I should say development of the lever action changed a lot. And here we have the 1873 Winchester lever action rifle. Besides being chambered in a much more potent round, a lot of design changes happened with the 1873 very specifically. One, you can see that there's a side plate here that's removable in a different way. You don't have to take out the actual lever screw to take off the side plates or clean the gun. There's one screw on the opposite side of the receiver right here. Once you pull that screw out, this plate comes off and this plate can come off, allowing you to do a lot of field maintenance without having to take the entire gun apart or remove the lever screw itself. Additionally, another couple things came about on this as well. There is now a safety on this system. You'll see right here, this little plunger has to be depressed by the lever, allowing the trigger to be pulled. This means that when this lever can only be closed all the way when the gun is fully in battery, and the only way that lever is depressed is when the lever is fully in battery. So when this is completely down, that actually deactivates the trigger safety, as you can see. Plunger goes down, as does the trigger safety, which means that you will not be able to fire the 1873 out of battery. It is possible, since there's no safety on the 1866 or 1860, that if you're running the gun fast enough, you can fire this out of battery. Typically, it's not a catastrophic failure to the shooter, but it will bend parts and break the gun. Again, once you get chambered to a more powerful cartridge like the 4440, however, perhaps there could be a more catastrophic result if that were to happen. So this safety is a huge improvement in terms of the reliability of the gun in the field, as well as to the shooter, and ensuring that the gun's only fired when it's completely in battery. However, besides the fact that it's now a case-hardened receiver and therefore stronger for the more powerful cartridge, the Kingsgate patent got slightly improved with this different types of radial cut. This one's a little bit more sharp. This one's easier to feed quicker in the field. And other than that, what you have here is the original Henry in 44 Henry rimfire was 15+1. Then when they went to the 1866, that stayed the same unless you got the carbine, which of course reduced the capacity because it reduced the length of the magazine. However, you have an enclosed magazine and a Kingsgate patent loading system. But then when you get to the 73, you now have 4440, far more potent cartridge, 13+1. You're only losing 2 from the original Henry capacity, with far better terminal ballistics, but a much stronger system with a safety, and also, I didn't even say this, a dust cover as well, which activates as you run the action. You close this, and as you cycle the toggle, this actually opens up, and then you close it when you're done. Another way to keep dirt and debris out of the field. At any rate, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. This is just a general synopsis of the origins and mechanical differences between the 1860, the 1866, and the 1873 Winchester lever-action rifle. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video about the fundamental basics of the origins of the quintessential American lever-action rifle. As I said, other things happened after 1873, and we'll get to those in other videos. But the takeaway here is that mechanically, with the exception of adding a safety and a Kingsgate patent, loading gate, the reality is this gun, which is the 1873, is fundamentally, functionally exactly the same thing that was developed in the late 1840s, early 1850s as the volcanic repeating arm, except it's chambered in a better cartridge. And as we see, the cartridge development was a fundamental and significant part of improving the Winchester lever-action rifle, well above and beyond any mechanical changes. The mechanical changes that ultimately culminated in the 1873 really perfected the system. It was now essentially impervious in many ways to dirt and debris, unlike the Henry, which had an open magazine, and the 1866, which didn't have a safety and was still chambered in a somewhat anemic 44 Henry rimfire compared to the now 4440. But other than that, functionally the same, and the ability to cycle the action and pull the trigger and hit your target as fast as you could do that was something that was a huge force multiplier for anyone that had one of these in the field. And they continue to be to this day. Of course, a lot of things have changed, but the lever-action rifle is still an amazing weapon. Guys, hopefully you like and enjoy this kind of content. It is completely Patreon supporters that have made this viable. These guns were purchased with Patreon funds, and you will see them and have seen them in matches on the video on the channel, and we'll see more of it in the future. If you do like this kind of content and are not a Patreon supporter, please consider it. It is only Patreon that keeps InRange alive. We have no support, no monetization, and no sponsorship from anywhere but the viewer like you. If you can't, we understand. Just subscribe and share with your friends because YouTube won't do it for us anymore. Thanks a lot.